The station was called Vethnar, which meant the middle place in Old Vareth. It floated between two star systems like a coin balanced on its edge belonging to neither side, claimed by no one, which was exactly why the Council had chosen it for this. First contact. The words had been broadcast across every Concord frequency for 3 weeks. Schools had shown it to children. Historians had started writing chapters they hadn't finished yet. 2 religious orders on the Vareth homeworld had declared the week holy. Seth was none of these things. Not a politician, not a priest, not a historian. He was the delegation's xenobiologist, assigned to watch, take notes, and tell the Council what he saw. He stood at the observation window of Docking Bay 7 and watched the human ship come in. It was smaller than he expected. He had read the briefing files twice. He knew the registered tonnage, the crew count, the diplomatic classification, civilian transport, medical grade life support, cultural delegation vessel, all the correct markings, all the right registrations, but the ship moved wrong, not badly. Nothing you could point at and name. It just moved the way a person moves when they are trying to look relaxed. There was a precision to it that did not belong on a civilian vessel. Every thruster correction was minimal. Every docking approach angle was exact. The pilot was very, very good. A very good pilot on a civilian transport was a small thing to notice. Seth noticed it. He wrote one line in his notebook. The pilot is military trained, or equivalent. Then he crossed it out. He was being paranoid. The Council had verified this ship 3 times. He put the notebook away and watched the docking clamps lock into place with a sound like a deep breath held and then released. The airlock opened and the humans came through. There were 9 of them. The ambassador walked first, a woman named Yara Osei, dark-skinned, gray at the temples, dressed in something dark blue that was formal without being stiff. She had the kind of posture that did not come from trying to have good posture. It just lived in her spine. Behind her came the rest in pairs, 2 cultural advisors, a medical officer, a communications specialist, 2 junior attachés, and 1 person whose role was listed in the manifest as logistics coordinator, but who had the quiet eyes of someone who counted exits when they walked into rooms. Seth counted the exits in the docking bay. There were 3. He looked at the logistics coordinator. The logistics coordinator had already found all 3. The first session was held in the station's main diplomatic hall, which the Vareth had spent 2 months decorating to be neutral. No Concord banners. No star maps showing territorial lines. Just a long table, chairs scaled for 2 different body types, and a translation system the engineering team had tested 400 times. It worked on the 501st try. During the actual meeting, Seth thought this was either very good timing or the universe having a sense of humor. Ambassador Osei sat across from Senior Delegate Vorak, who led the Vareth side, and the first 20 minutes were what the briefing files called exploratory exchange. Each side introduced itself, names, roles, organizational structures, standard first contact protocol, clean and dry and formal, the kind of language that was designed to be careful. Then the human junior attaché placed 3 wrapped packages on the table. This was not in the protocol. Vorak paused. The packages were wrapped in folded paper with a ribbon tied across the top. Seth had read about this practice in the cultural files. Humans gave physical objects to mark occasions they considered important. It was ancient, pre-industrial, something that had survived every technological revolution they had ever gone through, which, when Seth thought about it later, said something particular about what humans chose to keep. The junior attaché, a young man with an open face and a translation earpiece he kept adjusting, looked briefly at Ambassador Osei. She gave a small nod. Not encouraging, not directing. Just, yes, go ahead. We did not know what you would like, the attaché said, in passable Varath standard. His accent was wrong in 3 places and perfect in 7. But we thought something from home seemed right. Vorak looked at the packages, then at the attaché, then at Ambassador Osei. Osei waited. She was very good at waiting. Vorak opened the first package. It was a small carved figure, an animal 4-legged, long-necked, made from dark wood. The craftsmanship was extraordinary. The grain of the wood moved with the shape of the creature's body, as if the animal had grown inside the material, and the carver had only released it. Nobody at the Vareth side of the table said anything for a moment. Then Seth said, "What animal is this?" "A giraffe," the attaché said. They are very tall. They eat leaves from the tops of trees. He paused. We like them. I do not know exactly why. And the whole Verath side of the table laughed. Seth did not write anything down. He was too busy laughing. The first 3 days were like that. Not every moment there were long hours of careful, slow translation. Concepts that existed in one language and not the other. Misunderstandings that took 40 minutes to untangle and left everyone slightly tired. A 2-hour debate about what the word sovereign meant when applied to empty space that had no atmosphere and no surface and no one living on it and never had. But between these things, something else happened. The humans were funny, not perform funny. Not the careful kind of funny that comes from trying to put the other side at ease. The young attaché, his name was Danny, short for something longer that he said nobody used, made a joke on the second day about the translation system that made even senior delegate Vorak produce the Verath equivalent of a snort. The medical officer, a quiet woman named Reyes, had a habit of making very dry observations just under her breath that Seth's translation bead caught when no one else did, and twice he had to look down at the table because he was laughing, and it was not the right moment to be laughing. They were warm. That was the only word Seth had for it. They took up space in a room the way a fire took up space, not loudly, not pushily, but giving off heat without asking anything of you. When a Verath junior delegate dropped her water vessel and it rolled across the floor, 2 humans moved to help her at exactly the same moment. And then, both stopped and laughed at each other for it. And the junior delegate laughed too. And for about 15 seconds, the diplomatic hall sounded less like a first contact session and more like a room full of people who had known each other for years. Seth liked them. He noticed that he liked them and wrote it in his notebook. I like them. Note this. He had learned, over 20 years of fieldwork, to note the things he liked. Liking something had a way of making you stop looking at it clearly. The first real anomaly happened on the afternoon of the second day. The station ran its routine monthly emergency drill. Not because of anything specific, just the standard procedure that all stations ran regardless of who was aboard. Alarms went off for 30 seconds. The lights shifted to amber. A recorded voice asked all non-essential personnel to proceed to their designated muster stations. The Verath delegation moved, some faster than others. Vorak's aide nearly knocked over his chair. One of the cultural advisors, a young man who had never been on a station before, froze for a second before his colleague touched his arm and guided him along. Normal responses, the kind of small, controlled alarm that any reasonable person felt when a loud noise went off in an enclosed, pressurized structure in the middle of space. The human delegation moved too, but differently, not faster, not with any visible urgency. They simply moved with a purpose that looked nothing like a drill response. Without a word being spoken, without any signal Seth could identify, they separated into specific positions, one at the door, one near the window console, one beside the senior delegate's chair. Danny, who made everyone laugh and adjusted his earpiece and told you more about giraffes than you thought you needed to know. Danny had moved to stand between the Verath junior delegates and the main corridor entrance, and he was standing there the way you stand when you are between something you are protecting and something you have not identified yet. Wait forward. Back straight. Watching. 30 seconds later, the alarm stopped. The lights went back to normal. Everyone exhaled. The humans returned to their seats. Seth sat very still. He looked at Ambassador Ose. Her hands were folded on the table. They had been folded on the table the entire time. During the alarm. During the movement around her. During the 30 seconds when every Verath in the room had elevated pulse frills and the particular body voltage that came with not knowing if this alarm was real, her hands had not moved. Not once. Not one adjustment. Not one tightening of the fingers. Not one small tremor. He had seen negotiators trained for decades who still showed hand movement under sudden stress. It was automatic, physiological. Even people who had survived real emergencies showed it afterward, the body remembering what the mind had moved past. Her hands had not moved. Seth looked at her hands for a long time. Then he looked at his notebook and wrote, "Hand response, or absence of, emergency drill, second day, 1422. Delegate Ose. No visible stress response in peripheral motor control. Check baseline. Possible. Extreme training. Possible. Something else." He looked at something else for a while. Then he wrote underneath it, "Logistics coordinator also." He counted the exits before the drill alarm, not after. He already knew where they were. He underlined that last part. Then he put the notebook away and went back to watching the session. That evening, after the formal sessions ended and the delegations returned to their quarters, Seth sat in his small office on the research level and opened the public access Human Cultural Archive. He told himself he was doing background reading, contextual material for his behavioral notes. Routine. He started with mythology. 3 hours later, he was still reading. Every major human civilization, going back as far as their recorded history reached, had war built into its stories. Not as a problem to solve, not as a terrible thing that happened before the better times. As a time subject, time something to be examined, remembered, sung about, built monuments to, warned against, glorified, mourned, and returned to, again and again, across every format of human expression that had ever existed. Their oldest surviving poetry was about a war. Their most widely distributed religious texts contained wars, and the figures those texts considered worthy and good were, in a striking number of cases, warriors. Not warriors by accident or bad circumstance, warriors by choice, by calling, by something the texts treated as a kind of virtue. Their children learned songs that, when you ran the lyrics through the translation system without cultural softening, described battles. Cheerful songs. Songs children sang together. And the art. Seth spent an hour on just the art. Sculptures of soldiers. Paintings of burning cities and ships firing at each other, and men on horseback, with weapons raised above their heads. Museums dedicated specifically to the objects and tools of war helmets, blades, uniforms, flags preserved under controlled conditions, treated with the same reverence. A Vareth temple gave its oldest texts. The humans kept these things. They went to look at them on weekends. He was not frightened. He told himself that firmly. He was a scientist and this was data, and he was not going to read meaning into data before he had gathered enough of it. He wrote in his notebook, Human Cultural Archive saturated with conflict memory across all periods and all mediums. Unlike Concord member species, conflict not represented as historical trauma to move past, represented as ongoing subject requiring continued engagement. Observation only. Do not extrapolate. He looked at the word extrapolate for a long time. Then he closed the mythology section and opened the pre-contact diplomatic communication record, the public one, available to all Concord researchers, and read through 5 years of messages. The tone of every single message from the human side was the same. Warm, patient, cooperative. They had agreed to every proposed neutral site, without argument. They had accepted every protocol adjustment the Concord had requested. They had responded to every communication within 48 hours, which was faster than several Concord members responded to their own internal memos. They were easy to work with. Seth sat with that for a while. He thought about things that were easy to work with. He thought about whether that was always a comfort. On the third day, there was a small incident. Nothing diplomatic, just physics. A water recycling valve in the secondary corridor failed. And for about 20 minutes, a fine mist drifted through the intersection near the human quarters before the maintenance team arrived and sealed it. It was funny. The way small mechanical failures in space were funny. Technically a problem, practically harmless. The kind of thing that made everyone damp and mildly annoyed for a few minutes, and then laughed about afterward. Seth was walking past when it happened. He got caught in the mist at the same moment Danny was coming from the other direction. They both stopped, looked at each other, looked at the mist. What is? Seth started. Water valve, Danny said. Not a guess, a fact. He had already identified it. He looked up at the ceiling, found the valve housing, measured the angle of the mist with his eyes, and stepped to the left, to the exact position that kept the mist off his collar. 2 seconds. The whole thing took 2 seconds. Seth stood in the mist and watched Danny find dry ground and felt a feeling he did not write down yet. Danny grinned at him. You should step left. I know, Seth said. He stepped left. They stood together and waited for the maintenance team, and Danny told him about giraffes for 15 minutes. And by the end, Seth knew more about giraffes than he had ever expected to learn. He knew that giraffes were the tallest land animals on the human homeworld. He knew that a giraffe's heart was enormous, proportionally enormous, built to pump blood all the way up that long neck, and that, despite being so large, they were gentle animals, not fighters by nature. He knew that humans found them beautiful in a way that was hard to explain. He knew that the carving on the table had taken the craftsman 3 weeks. He was genuinely charmed. He was genuinely troubled by how charmed he was, because the thing about charm was that it worked whether or not it was meant to. That night, before sleep, Seth wrote the last entry for the day. Day 3 complete. Cultural exchange proceeding well. Human delegation continues to present as cooperative, warm, and genuinely interested in good relations. Behavioral anomalies noted in previous entries remain unexplained, but not yet escalated. I find that I like them. I said this already. I am saying it again because I want to keep noticing it. Noticing it is the job. Vorak said at dinner that this was going to be the easiest first contact in Concord history. He said humans were exactly what we hoped they would be. I do not know if that is a comfort. I keep thinking about her hands. I keep thinking about the logistics coordinator and the 3 exits he found before anyone told him to find them. I keep thinking about the cultural archive and the old songs and the museums full of things that were used to hurt people, preserved carefully, visited on days off. I think the warmth is real. I believe it is real. I have no evidence that it is performed, and every reason to think it is genuine. And also, and this is the part I cannot stop turning over, it is possible for something to be entirely real and still be, in some way I cannot name yet, a choice. They are very easy to like. I keep wondering if they know that. He closed the notebook. Across the station, in the human quarters, Ambassador Yara Ose sat at her small desk and composed a message on her encrypted personal channel. She read it once, changed one word, read it again, sent it. Then she folded her hands on the desk and looked at the wall. The message was 2 words long. Outside the station, in the dark between the 2 star systems, the sensors registered nothing unusual. A few fragments of old rock drifting in the deep cold. Background radiation. The quiet hum of space being space. Nothing else. Nothing at all. The station's deep-range arrays cycled through their routine sweep and found nothing, and logged nothing, and moved on. 3 decks below, in the engineering bay, a junior technician glanced at his board, saw a faint reading at the edge of sensor range, blinked, and looked again. It was gone. He marked it as equipment drift. He went back to his coffee. On the 4th day, the humans brought food, not as a formal gesture, not as a diplomatic offering with presentation and protocol. Danny simply appeared in the doorway of the research lounge at what humans called lunchtime, carrying a flat container with a seal on top and a small device that kept the temperature controlled. And he said, "We made too much. Are you hungry?" Seth was hungry. He said yes before he finished thinking about whether it was professionally appropriate to say yes. The food was warm and dense, and had a flavor that sat in a part of his palate he did not use often. He ate more than he intended. The medical officer, Reyes, sat across from him. She asked him questions about Verith digestive biology that were technically detailed enough that Seth suspected she had read the xenobiology files before asking. She framed them as casual questions. They were not casual questions, but the way she asked them made answering feel easy. And by the time the meal was done, Seth had explained 3 things about Verith biochemistry that were not in any public file. He realized this later. In the moment, he had just been talking. He wrote in his notebook that evening, Reyes. Medical background. Asks precise questions that do not feel precise. Note this method. Then he drew a small line under it and wrote, The food was very good. He was going to cross that part out. He left it. The negotiations on day 4 moved into harder territory. Trade routes, resource access. The Concord's position on newly mapped systems that sat between human-claimed space and Verith-adjacent territory. These were the kinds of conversations that took years in normal diplomacy and sometimes did not resolve at all. Ambassador Osi sat down with Vorak, and the terms she laid out were the only word for it was generous. The Concord's senior trade advisor, sitting 2 seats to Vorak's left, kept looking at his own notes as if he suspected a mistranslation. He requested clarification 3 times on the transit rights clause alone. Every time, the translation was correct. The humans were offering good terms, very good terms. The kind of terms you offered when you wanted something, but Seth could not find what they wanted. The kind of terms you offered when you were afraid, but he could not find the fear. The kind of terms you offered when the other side had something valuable you needed access to, but the Concord's resource inventory was public, and the humans had equivalent or superior access to most of what it listed. He watched Osei throughout the afternoon session. She presented the terms calmly. She answered every question fully. She did not rush. She did not oversell. She sat in her chair the way a mountain sat in a landscape, not because it was trying to be impressive, but simply because that was the shape of it. When Vorax 8 pushed back on one clause politely but firmly, the way the Concord taught its people to push back, Osei listened to the full objection, paused for exactly as long as she needed to, and offered a revision that addressed the objection without giving up anything she had not already planned to give up. Seth was watching her face when she offered the revision. Nothing moved in it that she did not choose to move. He had interviewed 47 sentient species in his career. He had sat across from ambassadors and warlords and scientists and criminals and ordinary people in the worst moments of their lives. He had learned to read faces the way he had learned to read weather, not perfectly, not always, but well enough to know when something was being held back. He could not read her face, not because it was blank. It was not blank. It was warm and present and appropriately expressive and made all the right movements at all the right moments. It was exactly what a face should do in this room at this table. That was the problem. It was too exactly right. He wrote in his notebook, Osei's expressions are contextually perfect. Correct warmth, correct seriousness, correct thoughtfulness at correct moments. Either she is a naturally gifted diplomat or she has complete control of her face. Possibly both. Do not conflate naturalness with lack of control. And he underlined complete control of her face and stared at it. Then he closed his notebook and paid attention to the session. That night, at 0300 station time, the deep range arrays registered contact. The technician on duty was a young Verith named Oren who had worked the night shift for 2 years and found it peaceful. Not much happened at 0300. Ships did not usually travel through this region. It was a navigational awkward spot, gravitationally speaking. Not dangerous but inconvenient enough that most traffic went around. The neutral station sat in genuine quiet out here. That was the point of it. The reading came in at the edge of sensor range. Maximum distance. Minimum resolution. Basically just a mass reading, which was a number that told you something was there without telling you much about what. The number was large. The number was very large. And then it was gone. Oren ran a diagnostic. All systems returned clean. He checked the array calibration. Normal. He looked at the reading for a while, typed a line in his log times possible contact. Mass reading at outer sensor range. No follow-up signal, probable equipment drift or spatial debris times, and went back to his other work. In the morning, the log entry was reviewed by the duty supervisor. The duty supervisor had 17 other items that morning. He flagged the entry as low priority, assigned it to the equipment maintenance queue, and moved on. The entry sat in the queue. Seth spent day 5 in the archive. He told himself, and told the delegation coordinator who asked, that he was completing routine cultural background research, background material, contextual notes, things a xenobiologist was supposed to do. He pulled the human military history files. They were public, fully public, not classified, not restricted, available to any Concord researcher with a registered access account. He had the account. He had never used it for this before because it had not seemed relevant before. He started with the pre-FTL era, which was technically the only period that fell within the scope of his assigned research. And he told himself he would read for 1 hour and then get back to the behavioral notes. He was still reading 6 hours later. The numbers were hard to process, not because they were large. Seth had studied species with long histories and large populations and understood that large population events produced large numbers. The numbers were hard to process because of the time's frequency. Humans had been having large-scale organized conflicts, wars, they called them. A word that appeared in every language they had ever developed, for as far back as their record-keeping went. Not occasionally, not once per civilization era, constantly. There was not, as far as Seth could find, a single century in human recorded history that did not contain multiple wars happening simultaneously on different parts of their homeworld. He found this, and then checked it 3 times because he thought he had misread something. He had not misread anything. And the weapons, he spent a long time on the weapons. Not because he was looking for them, because the archive was organized chronologically and the weapons section was embedded in every era. Because weapons were part of every era, Because humanity across every culture and every time period had devoted extraordinary creative and intellectual resources to making better weapons, better at range, better at force, better at speed, better at doing more with less, and then better at doing even more than that. The Industrial Revolution on the human homeworld had, within 2 generations, gone from producing better farm tools to producing weapons capable of killing 10,000 people in a single event. They had used those weapons, and then they had made better ones. Seth sat back from his screen and looked at the ceiling for a while. He thought about what he knew about the Verith, his own species. They had fought wars too. He was not naive enough to think the Concord had a clean history. But the Verith wars were separated by long stretches of peace, long enough that each new conflict came as something of a shock, a wound, something that had to be recovered from. His people had a particular word, untranslatable, roughly for the feeling of a society after a major war. The word described exhaustion and relief, and a collective agreement to not do that again for a very long time. He could not find the human equivalent of that word. He looked for it for an hour. He searched synonyms and associated terms and emotional vocabulary indexes. The closest thing he found was a human word that described the period between wars. The word did not mean peace. It meant time's peacetime, a time that was defined by the absence of the other thing, not by its own nature. He turned that over in his mind for a long time. Then he went back to the archive and found the section on the last global human war, the final one. The one that ended about 120 years before first contact, and he read it start to finish. The war had killed an enormous number of people. Afterward, the surviving nations had built international institutions, negotiation frameworks, systems for cooperation. They had worked very hard to make the institutions good. They were, by most measures, genuinely good. And then, at the end of the historical entry, there was a line that stopped him. Despite the post-war institutional framework, humanity continued to maintain significant military capability on all major political entities through the subsequent century, with global military expenditure remaining at levels consistent with active wartime preparedness. He read that sentence again. Active wartime preparedness, through a century of peace. He put his hand flat on the desk, not because he was frightened. He was not frightened. He was a scientist, and this was data. He pressed his hand flat on the desk and breathed for a moment, and then he picked up his notebook and wrote carefully. Question: what does a species at peace look like when it has never fully lowered its readiness for the alternative? He did not write an answer. He did not have one yet. He filed the archive session and went to the evening dinner. Danny asked him at dinner if he had eaten the leftovers from lunch, because there were more leftovers today and he could bring them to Seth's office if Seth wanted. Seth said yes. He was quiet over dinner. Not visibly, he answered questions. He participated. He laughed at the right moments. But inside he was running things through in parallel, the way he always did, when a research problem had lodged itself in his processing and would not move. He watched the humans at the table. He watched Danny, who was making a junior Verith delegate demonstrate the correct way to hold his water vessel, because Danny had been holding his wrong for 4 days and finally decided to ask. He watched Reyes, who was in a quiet conversation with one of the Verith cultural advisors about how music worked across species, a conversation that sounded like small talk and contained, Seth now suspected, a level of careful listening that was not small at all. He watched Osei. She was talking to Vorak about something. They were both smiling. Vorak said something that was probably a joke, and Osei laughed a real laugh, or a perfect copy of one. And Seth had genuinely lost the ability to determine which. He thought. She is very good at this, he thought. They are all very good at this. And then he thought a thing he had been trying not to think, which was, being very good at being liked is a skill. It is a skill people practice. And the question of why a person practices any particular skill came down to what they expected to need it for. He looked at the gifts on the side table. They had moved them there after the first session, displayed them the way you displayed things you valued. The carved giraffe, a small music box that played a few bars of something when you opened it, a sealed container of a human spice that the Verith side had not opened yet but had thanked them for thoroughly. The gifts were genuine. He believed that. He also believed that the pilot of that ship was military trained, and the logistics coordinator had counted 3 exits before anyone asked him to, and the drill response had looked like a rehearsed deployment And Osei's hands did not shake. Both things were true. He was sure of that. Both things, at the same time, were true. He just did not know what they added up to yet. On the 6th night it happened again. 2 arrays this time. Different angles. Same outer range zone. Same enormous mass reading. And then nothing. The reading lasted 11 seconds before it vanished. Long enough that this time 2 technicians saw it, and they looked at each other across the monitoring bay, and one of them ran a cross-check between the 2 array readings to see if they resolved into a position. They did. The object, if it was an object, had been approximately 900,000 kilometers off the station's starboard side. 900,000 kilometers was far. Safe. Comfortable distance by any measure. It was also well within weapons range of anything with serious long-range capability. The cross-check result went into a separate report. That report was flagged for the morning duty supervisor, same as Oren's report from 2 nights ago. The morning supervisor had 22 items. He sent both reports to the station's sensor analysis team, which had a 3-day queue. The reports sat in the queue. Seth, who did not know any of this, spent the 6th evening doing something he had not planned. He went back to the archive and searched for a specific term. It took him 40 minutes to find the right search parameters because the term was structural, the kind of thing that you had to already understand to search for correctly. But eventually he found it. He was looking for the human word or concept for deliberately not showing what you were capable of. He expected to find it in the diplomatic vocabulary, or maybe in the negotiation literature. He found it in the military strategy section. The concept was old. Extremely old. One of the oldest recorded strategic principles humanity had documented. The idea was simple. Do not let your opponent know the full extent of your capability until the moment you need to use it. Appear smaller, appear slower, appear less than you are. Give the other side a picture of you that is comfortable for them to hold. And hold it steady. Right up until the moment the picture needs to change. The humans had a word for the force that revealed itself at that moment. The word was times deterrent. He sat with that. He looked around the archive for the entry on human deterrence theory, and he found it, and he started to read, and 50 minutes later, he stopped reading, and closed the screen, and sat in the dark of his small office for a while. The entry was not frightening on its own. The theory was not about aggression. It was, in its own logic, about preventing violence, about making the cost of attack so obviously catastrophic that no rational actor would attempt it. It was, in its own logic, a form of peacekeeping. The part that sat in Seth's chest like a cold stone was the last line of the entry. For deterrence to function, the capability must be real. He looked at his notebook. He had written many things in the last 6 days. He read back through them, starting from day 1. The pilot, the exits, the hands, the drill response, Danny and the water valve, the archive, the old wars, the peacetime military spending. He stared at the last entry about deterrence for a long time. Then he picked up his pen and added one line. Question. If the human delegation on this station is a diplomatic team, what is the ship in Bay 7? He put the pen down. He picked it up again. Follow-up question. If the ship in Bay 7 is not just a diplomatic transport, what is out there in the dark that we cannot see? He looked at that question. He did not sleep well that night. The next morning he pulled the Human Naval Database. Public access, same as the archive. Available to any registered researcher in the Concord's information sharing network, because humanity had joined that network as one of their very first gestures of cooperative goodwill. He searched by vessel class. He searched by tonnage. He thought about the mass readings from the sensor logs. He had not seen those logs, did not know they existed, but he had his own calculation from 6 days of watching and thinking. He was thinking about what class of vessel would fit the shape of the absence he had been observing. The precise docking, the military-trained pilot, the crew that moved in an emergency the way people moved when they had practiced emergencies many times. He worked backward from behavior to hardware, the way a field researcher sometimes had to when the direct data was not available. He built a rough estimate of the vessel type he was looking for. Then he searched the database. He got a result. The entry was in the historical records section. 40 years old. The vessel class had been retired, decommissioned. The file said approximately 38 years ago, after a long service history. He looked at the performance specifications. He looked at the mass figures. He sat completely still for a long moment. Then he looked at the mass figures again, because sometimes the first time you read something you are reading it wrong, and you need to read it again to be certain. He was reading it correctly. He put the notebook flat on the desk and pressed both hands on it and stared at the wall. The file was 40 years old. Retired class, the header said. Decommissioned. He looked at the mass estimates he had built from the behavioral evidence. There were 6 of them out there. The morning of day 7 started quietly. Seth arrived at the research lounge early, before the sessions began, and sat with his notebook and a warm cup of the station's bitter, reconstituted coffee, which he had developed a tolerance for over 2 years of postings. He had not written anything new since the night before. He had been waiting to see if the feeling settled before he put it into words, because feelings that went into a notebook too fast came out wrong, too sharp, too certain, not enough room for the possibility that he had simply miscalculated. He had not miscalculated. He knew that. 6 years of field training and 14 years of working experience told him he had not miscalculated. But he was also a scientist, and he understood that the gap between very likely and certain was a gap you did not cross without evidence. And what he had was math built on behavior, built on absence, and that was not the same as evidence. He was still sitting with that when Danny came in, already holding his own coffee, and dropped into the seat across from him with the easy comfort of someone who had decided they were allowed to do that. "You look like you've been awake since midnight," Danny said. "I have been awake since midnight," Seth said. Danny nodded, the way you nodded at something that confirmed what you already suspected. "What are you working on?" "Background research," Seth said. "Cultural material." Danny looked at him over his cup. "Is it interesting?" Seth thought about the deterrence entry, the mass figures, the 6 decommissioned ships that the log said were gone and his math said were not. "Very," he said. Danny nodded again. He did not ask what the material was. He talked instead about a Vareth dish he had tried the night before that he was still thinking about, and whether it was rude to ask the kitchen for the recipe. And Seth told him it was not rude. It was actually considered a compliment. And Danny made a note of this in the small personal device he kept in his breast pocket. Seth watched him make the note. He thought about asking him directly, picking a single clear question and putting it flat on the table the way Osei put her terms. Flat on the table, no decoration, no diplomatic wrapping, just, what is out there in the dark, off our starboard side? He did not ask. He did not ask because he was not certain, and because the sessions were going well, and because he was a xenobiologist and not a security officer, and because he could not be sure his math was right, and because even if his math was right he did not know what it meant, and because Danny was sitting across from him looking completely ordinary and talking about kitchen etiquette, and it was very hard to hold both versions of this person in his head at the same time. He drank his coffee. The morning session began an hour later. The comm blackout started at 11:42. No warning, no static, no degraded signal, no indicator of system trouble. The station's communications simply stopped. Every channel, internal, external, diplomatic, emergency, went flat at exactly the same moment. Seth was in the diplomatic hall when it happened. He was sitting against the back wall, taking notes, while Vorak and Osei worked through the 3rd revision of the Transit Rights Clause. The translation system's status light, which sat in the upper corner of the main screen, went from green to gray. The screen itself stayed on, the local systems were still running, but the connection indicator, the small icon that showed the station was linked to the wider Concord network, was gone. There was a brief pause. The kind of pause a room produces when something changes and everyone feels it, but no one has named it yet. Then the hull groaned. Not a catastrophic sound. Not the sound of structural failure. A lower, longer sound, the sound of pressure differential, of something hitting the outer shell with enough force to be felt inside but not enough to breach. Then, another. Then, from somewhere in the direction of the commercial wing, a sound that was definitely an impact, and definitely harder than the others. The alarm started 4 seconds later. This alarm was not the drill. The Vareth side of the room moved fast and badly. Vorak's aide grabbed the wrong document case and dropped it. A junior delegate knocked her chair over, getting up, and then stood in the wrong direction, facing the wall, before reorienting. The cultural advisor who had frozen during the drill froze again, and this time his colleague was not fast enough to catch him. Seth grabbed his arm and pulled him toward the door before his legs found themselves again. Seth was frightened. He knew what frightened felt like in his body, the pulse frills lifting, the chest tightening, the particular clarity of focus that came when the situation narrowed to a single question, which was, where is the safe place and how do I get there? He was moving toward the corridor with the junior delegate's arm in his hand, and the alarm still going, and the translation system's light still gray, and he was frightened all the way through. He was moving through the door when he noticed the human side of the room. They were moving too, but they were not going toward the corridor. They separated the way a hand separates into fingers, each one going a specific direction, finding a specific position, without any visible communication. The communications specialist went directly to the wall panel and started working it with both hands, not frantically, with focus, with the specific calm of someone who had decided that this was the task and the task was what mattered. The logistics coordinator moved to the main door and stood in it, not blocking. Positioning, he was counting. People coming through, Seth realized. He was making sure everyone got out. Reyes had her medical kit open before Seth reached the corridor. She had not needed to look for it. She knew exactly where it was in her bag, down to the centimeter. Danny was already gone. Seth looked around and could not find him, and then he found him ahead of the group, down the secondary corridor, standing at the junction, where it met the main evacuation route, directing Verith staff through a path that did not appear on any of the emergency maps Seth had studied during his station orientation 2 years ago. He was not guessing. He was not reading signs. He knew the route. Seth ran to catch up with the group, and as he ran, he thought, when did he learn that? The station's emergency announcements came back 6 minutes after the blackout ended. The communications specialist had done something to the wall panel that Seth did not understand and probably would not understand if he asked. And the internal system came up, not the external network, just internal, and the announcement voice told them what they had already suspected. The Kreth. 3 ships. They had come in from the unmapped side, the gravitational awkward zone that ships did not travel through, and they had hit the commercial wing's outer section with a focused pulse weapon that damaged the structure without fully breaching it. A warning. In Kreth tactical language, the Kreth were precise about their warnings. The next one would not be a warning. The Kreth Dominion was not a major power. They were mid-tier, and they knew it. Which was why they had spent 30 years developing a very specific skill set, fast, overwhelming first strikes against targets that could not afford to fight back. They had done this 4 times. They had won all 4 times. The Concord had responded each time with diplomatic pressure and economic sanction, which was the Concord's standard response, and which the Kreth had absorbed without apparent difficulty. They did not want a human-conquered alliance. This was, in Kreth political terms, a message. The main group had assembled in the station's emergency muster point, a reinforced central hub with its own life support, designed to hold 200 people for 72 hours. Seth counted as they came in. 43 Verith staff and delegates, 9 humans. All 9 humans. He counted twice. All 9. He did not know how all 9 had ended up in the muster point without losing anyone. He had been present for the movement from the diplomatic hall, and he had still not quite tracked it. The humans had been everywhere at once, and then they were all here, accounted for, no one missing. Vorak was shaking. Not visibly, he was a senior delegate with decades of experience, and he was holding himself very well, but his pulse frills were fully elevated and the color in them was wrong, the pale, rapid flutter that Seth associated with deep system stress. He was standing very straight and breathing through his nose and doing all the things a diplomat did when the situation required him to be fine. Seth looked at Ose. She was standing 3 meters from Vorak. She was listening to something in her earpiece. Her eyes were on the muster point's entry corridor. Her hands were at her sides. Still, not rigid, not clenched, just still. She looked like someone waiting for a bus. The thought was absurd, and Seth thought it anyway because it was accurate. Everyone else in the room looked like what they were, which was people in an emergency on a station under attack. She looked like someone in a mild inconvenience, waiting for it to resolve. And then he watched something shift in her, not in her face, not in her posture. Something underneath those things, some decision made, some internal marker reached. She reached up and touched her earpiece once. She looked at the logistics coordinator. He looked back. One nod. So small Seth almost missed it. The logistics coordinator turned and walked to Danny. and said something very quietly in his ear. Danny put his coffee down on the floor beside him. He had somehow still been holding his coffee and straightened. The Kreth landing party came through the outer breach in the commercial wing and made it to the diplomatic section in under 8 minutes. 8 minutes was fast for a boarding action on a station this size. The Kreth were good at this. They had done it before. 8 soldiers in full tactical configuration, moving in pairs, making no unnecessary noise. Professional, efficient, confident the way people were confident when they had done a thing enough times to know how it went. The first pair came around the corner of the main corridor at a run and stopped. The corridor was empty. They moved forward. 2 more corners, 2 more empty corridors. They reached the junction outside the main diplomatic hall, and the 4 behind them caught up, and they regrouped and moved toward the muster point access corridor. And that was where the 2 humans were. Just 2. Seth was not in the corridor. He was in the muster point, watching through the doorway with about 15 other people, who had positioned themselves where they could see without being seen. He did not entirely understand how that positioning had happened. The logistics coordinator had said something general about sightlines and people had moved. He had moved too, so he saw it, or most of it. What he saw: 8 Kreth soldiers in tactical configuration entering a corridor with 2 humans in it. What he saw: both humans were unarmed, as far as he could tell. What he saw: the first 4 Kreth moved forward, and the 2 humans moved. And then, there was a very brief period that he could not fully process in real time, because it was too fast, and his eyes were not designed to track at that speed. What he saw next: 4 seconds had passed. 4 of the 8 Kreth were on the floor. The other 4 had not made it past the threshold. The 2 humans were standing in the corridor. One of them had a small cut above his eye. The other one was checking her sleeve, which had torn. She looked at the tear, with mild irritation. Then she looked up at the corridor and her eyes moved across it, the way you moved your eyes across a room when you were looking for the next thing that needed dealing with. Seth stood in the doorway of the muster point and looked at the 4 soldiers on the floor, and then at the 2 humans, and then at the 4 seconds that had just happened in the space where 8 soldiers used to be standing. He could not find a way to make that math work, not the physical math. He understood, in abstract terms, that human beings had extensive combat training built into their military and paramilitary services, that hand-to-hand engagement was a documented human skill going back tens of thousands of years, that the element of surprise and corridor geography were significant tactical factors, that 4 seconds was long enough for a great many things to happen if you knew exactly what you were doing. He understood all of that. He still could not make the math work. Vorak was making calls. The external network was still down, but the internal system was up, and he was talking to the station commander, who was talking to the engineering team, who was talking to the systems trying to restore the external comms. The language in the muster point was fast and overlapping, and everyone was doing something, and Seth was standing by the wall doing nothing because there was nothing for him to do. He was watching Ose. She had moved to the far corner of the muster point, and she was on her own communication channel, her encrypted personal one, the one she had sent the 2-word message from on the first night. She was speaking very quietly, and he could not hear what she was saying, and he watched her face while she spoke. Her face did the right things. Attentive, processing, a small nod, another small nod, then something that was almost a reaction. The tiniest shift around her eyes, something that a person who was not watching very carefully would not catch. It was there for maybe half a second. Then it was gone, and her face was exactly right again. He did not know what that half-second meant. He did not know if it was good news or bad news or news of a different kind entirely. He only knew that it had happened, and that it was the first time in 7 days that he had seen something on that face that looked like it had arrived from the inside rather than been placed there. She finished her call. She stood in the corner for a moment. Then she walked out of the corner and across the muster point and stopped in front of Vorak and said, in a voice that was calm enough to be alarming, "Senior Delegate, the Kreth fleet is moving into attack position. I need you to know that we are aware of this situation, and we are handling it." Quote. Vorak looked at her. "Who is we?" he said. She looked at him steadily. "The way a person looked at you when they were deciding how much of the answer to give you." "We," she said, and she walked past him to stand in front of the muster point's single forward-facing display, which was showing the external sensor feed. which was showing the Kreth fleet arranging itself in the formation that Seth recognized from the military history files as a second strike configuration. 12 ships, against a station with shields at 40% and no combat vessels in response range. Seth looked at the display. He looked at Osei standing in front of it. He thought about the file that was 40 years old. He thought, retired class, decommissioned, and then he thought, there were 6 of them out there. He thought about what 6 of those meant against 12 Kreth ships. He stood in the muster point and watched the display and waited, and the room was very loud with everyone's fear except for one corner of it, where the 9 humans stood in a loose group, quiet, still, watching the same display he was watching, and Danny, who made everyone laugh, who had told him about giraffes, who had stood in a corridor junction and guided civilians through routes he had memorized without being asked. Danny was standing with his arms crossed, and his coffee long gone, and his eyes on the numbers on the display, and his face was, Seth realized, the face of someone who was not afraid of what was coming. Not brave, not bravely suppressing fear. Just not afraid, as if what was coming was not a surprise, as if it was, in some way that Seth did not yet have the right words for, already handled. Ambassador Osei stood in front of the display with her hands at her sides, and she did not say anything else to anyone, and her hands did not move. And outside in the dark, the Kreth fleet moved into position, and the station's shields held at 40%, and Seth looked at all of it and felt the shape of a thing he could not name yet, pressing against the inside of his understanding, like something very large, leaning against a door. He was going to know what was on the other side of that door very soon. He was not ready. He watched Osei's hands. They were still. The Kreth fleet commander sent his surrender demand at 12:31 station time. It came through on a broad channel not aimed at anyone specifically, aimed at everything. The way you aimed a demand, when you were confident enough in the answer, that the recipient did not much matter. The translation system rendered it cleanly, because the Kreth were not subtle about their language. The message said, "You have 60 seconds to signal compliance, after which we will begin a full structural engagement on the station." It said this the way a man said it who had sent the same message 4 times before and received the same answer 4 times before and found the process unremarkable. The station commander's voice came over the internal channel immediately after. She told everyone in the muster point to stay where they were. She told them the shield systems were holding. She told them a response was being prepared. She did not say what kind of response. Seth was counting. Not the 60 seconds, he was counting the Kreth ships on the display. 12. Arranged in a spread formation that the military history archive called a containment envelope. He had looked up that term 2 days ago without knowing why. He knew why now. A containment envelope was designed to prevent escape and ensure complete coverage of a stationary target. It was the formation you used when you were certain nothing was coming to help the thing you were hitting. 40 seconds. He looked at the humans. They were arranged in the same loose group they had been standing in since the muster point filled. No visible change. Danny had picked up someone else's coffee at some point, not his. It was the wrong color and was holding it with both hands. Reyes had her medical kit closed and at her feet. The logistics coordinator was looking at the display with the focused, flat expression of someone reading a document that confirmed what they had already read elsewhere. 30 seconds. Vorak moved to stand beside Seth. He did not say anything. He looked at the display and then at the humans and then back at the display. His pulse frills were still elevated, but the color in them had changed. The rapid, pale flutter of deep system stress had shifted into something slower. Something that was not calm but was adjacent to it. The color of a person who has decided that being afraid is no longer the most useful thing they can do. 20 seconds. Ambassador Osei had not moved from her position in front of the display. She was watching the Kreth formation, with her hands at her sides and her chin level, and her eyes tracking steadily across the numbers. She looked, Seth thought, like a woman watching a clock. Not anxious, not resigned, just watching, the way you watched something whose behavior you had anticipated and were now simply waiting to observe confirm itself. 10 seconds. The room got very quiet, not the quiet of calm, the quiet of people holding their breath in the same direction at the same moment, which was a different thing. The 60 seconds ran out. Nothing happened. For 3 full seconds after the demand expired, nothing happened, and in those 3 seconds, Seth felt something very specific. which was the particular confusion of a moment that has not matched its own logic. The Kreth were not people who waited past their own deadlines. They had not waited before. Then something appeared on the long-range sensors. Not one ship. The display updated the way displays updated when the sensors were suddenly getting significantly more information than they were getting before a brief lag while the system processed. Then, everything at once. The sensor returns came in as mass readings first, the way they always did at range, and the numbers populated across the screen one after another, and Seth watched them come in and felt the room change around him, as everyone else watched them come in too. 6 contacts, already inside the Kreth formation's perimeter, already inside weapons range, inside close weapons range, not the long-range edge, but the middle band, where targeting was easier and response time was shorter, and the geometry of engagement tilted hard in favor of whoever arrived first. They had been there, not traveling toward the station, not responding and closing the distance. Already there, already inside the envelope, which meant they had been positioned before the envelope was formed, before the Kreth completed their approach, possibly before the attack on the commercial wing, possibly, and this was the thought Seth held at arm's length and looked at very carefully, possibly, before the diplomatic sessions began. Vorak said something quietly beside him in Old Vareth that did not translate but did not need to. The Kreth fleet commander sent a second transmission. It was much shorter than the first one, it asked, in language that had lost its earlier confidence, for identification of the new contacts. Nobody answered. The 6 contacts decloaked in sequence, not all at once in sequence, one after another, which Seth would think about later and understand was a choice. A deliberate pacing, each ship materializing on the display at a measured interval that gave the Kreth sensors enough time to process each one fully before the next appeared. It was, he realized later, almost educational. Here is one. Now here is another. Now another. Take your time. Understand what you are looking at. 5 escorts came first. They were large. Not the largest class of vessel Seth had encountered in the Concorde's records, but large enough that the Kreth's containment formation, which had looked solid 20 seconds ago, now looked like something drawn in sand. Each escort was running full active sensors, no passive observation. Full active, broadcasting its presence loudly and completely, which in naval terms was the equivalent of standing up in a room and making sure everyone saw your face. The Kreth commander sent another transmission, shorter still. Then the 6th ship came. It came last and it came slowly, which was also a choice, because nothing that size moved slowly by accident. The mass readings populated on the display, and the system took longer than usual to process them because the system had not been calibrated for something of that weight in this region of space, and it ran its verification sequence twice before it committed to the numbers. The numbers were very large. Seth had seen those numbers before. In the archive, 40 years ago, in a file marked retired, decommissioned, historical record only. He had matched them to his behavioral math 2 nights ago in his office, and sat with his hand flat on the desk, and breathed. He stopped breathing now. The Dreadnought came out of stealth the way a continent would come out of stealth if continents could move, not dramatically, not with any apparent effort, just present, in the way that very large and very certain things were present. It positioned itself at the center of the Kreth formation, with the geometry of something that had chosen this exact spot, and was satisfied with the choice. The Kreth commander's transmission came in 14 seconds later. It was 3 words. The translation system rendered them as, "What is that?" Nobody on the human side answered that either. Seth watched the display. He watched the Kreth formation, which had been a containment envelope 20 seconds ago, and was now 12 ships discovering that the thing they had enveloped had friends. He watched the escort vessels hold their positions. He watched the Dreadnought sit in the center of it all like a fact, not threatening, not posturing, just present, in the way that facts were present, which was completely and without apology. He thought about the mass figures. He thought about the hull rating, the weapons classification, the range specifications he had read in the archive. He thought about what those specifications meant against 12 Kreth ships arranged in a formation that had been designed for a station, not for this. He thought about the word deterrence. For deterrence to function, the capability must be real. The Kreth commander sent one more transmission. It was the longest one since the surrender demand. It covered, in rapidly assembled diplomatic language, The Kreth Dominion's position that this situation had arisen from a misunderstanding, that there was no hostile intent toward the station or its occupants, that the Dominion was prepared to open communications regarding a peaceful resolution, that the earlier structural engagement had been a demonstration of concern about the pace of negotiations and not an act of aggression, and that the Dominion looked forward to a constructive. The Dreadnought fired. Twice. The first shot covered the distance to its target in the kind of time that made distance irrelevant. The second followed before the first had resolved. Both were precisely placed not at the Kreth ships closest to the station, not at the ones that posed the most immediate threat. At the two ships that anchored the formation's escape routes, the two ships that, if they were still in place, made withdrawal difficult for the other 10. They were not still in place. The Kreth formation broke. What followed was not a battle, in the sense Seth understood battles from the archive, not an exchange, not two sides pressing against each other with losses on both. It was something else. Something that did not have a clean word in Vareth or in the Concord's standard diplomatic vocabulary. The escort vessels moved, and the Kreth ships moved, and the Dreadnought moved very little, and it lasted 9 minutes and 40 seconds by the station's internal clock, which Seth watched the whole time in the corner of the display. At the 9-minute and 40-second mark, the Kreth fleet ceased to be a formation. It ceased, in any practical sense that mattered for the purposes of this situation, to be a fleet. The muster point was very loud after. Relief was a physical thing in a room. When it arrived, a sound and a pressure change and a collective exhale that felt like the station itself breathing out. People were talking, some of them at the same time, some of them to no one in particular. Vorak had his hand on the shoulder of a junior delegate, who looked like she might sit down abruptly at any moment. The cultural advisor who kept freezing in emergencies was not frozen. He was talking fast and gesturing wide and telling the story of the past 9 minutes to anyone who would listen, already building it into a shape that would be comfortable to hold. Seth was not listening to any of it. He had found the crew feed channels. They were not classified. The diplomatic access package that all delegation members received included monitoring access to non-sensitive crew communications on affiliated vessels. It was a transparency measure, something the humans had offered as part of the access framework. Look at us. Nothing hidden. Here is what our crews are doing. He had pulled the feed without thinking. His hands had done it before he had decided to do it. He watched the crew feeds from the human vessels. He watched the escort crews first. He watched them work post-engagement assessment, position confirmation, sensor sweeps, the methodical machinery of a crew processing what had just happened and determining what came next. Efficient, professional, competent in the way that people were competent when they had trained for something long enough that it had gone from skill to reflex. He watched them for signs of what he expected to see. Relief. The released tension sounds. The laughter that came after a hard thing was survived. The particular noise of people who had been afraid and were no longer afraid, not celebration, necessarily, but that specific exhale, that moment where the body finished metabolizing the fear it had been running on and arrived, briefly, at the other side of it. He watched the escort crews. He changed the feed to the Dreadnought. He watched the Dreadnought crew. He sat very still. They were working. Just working. Systematic, methodical, task to task. Damage assessment, checking their own systems, though the Dreadnought had not taken a hit, but you checked your systems anyway, because that was what you did after an engagement. That was the procedure. Debris tracking, logging positions, compiling the post-action report that would go up the chain. One technician was running a calibration cycle on a sensor array that had performed perfectly, running it again because the procedure said, you ran it again. A young gunner, Seth could see his face. He could not have been more than 25 by human aging standards, was sitting at his station, eating a meal. A meal. A real meal. Not a ration pack. A heated meal in a proper container. And he was eating it with full attention, the way you ate something you were genuinely enjoying. He was not relieved. He was not relieved because he had not been afraid. None of them had been afraid. Seth closed the feed. He sat in the noise of the muster point and the relief and the voices, and he sat very still in the middle of all of it, and he thought about the gifts. The wrapped presents with ribbons on top, the carved giraffe that had taken 3 weeks to make, the music box that played a few bars of something when you opened it, He thought about Danny, and the bad translator jokes, and the giraffes and the kitchen etiquette, and the 15 minutes in the mist by the water valve. He thought about how easy it was to like him. He thought about that corridor junction, and the routes Danny had memorized without being asked. He thought about Reyes asking precise questions that did not feel precise. He thought about the logistics coordinator and the 3 exits. He thought about the drill, the hands, the 40 years of peacetime, military spending. He thought about the deterrence file and times the capability must be real times and the archive full of old songs with body counts that children sang cheerfully. He thought about 9 minutes and 40 seconds. He thought about the gunner eating his meal. He thought about the word that sat under all of this, the word he had been circling for 7 days without landing on it, and he landed on it now, and it was not a comfortable landing. They were never afraid, not brave, not trained past fear, not disciplined enough to look calm when they were not calm. Never afraid, because what was coming was not a surprise, because the Kreth making their move, the attack on the commercial wing, the fleet positioning, the surrender demand, the 60 seconds, all of it was, from the human perspective, not an emergency. It was an outcome they had anticipated and prepared for and positioned against before the first diplomatic session had even begun. Before the station knew the Kreth were coming, before the Concorde security assessments had flagged the threat. The gifts were genuine. The warmth was genuine. Danny's jokes were genuine, and Reyes's curiosity was genuine, and Osei's patient, careful diplomacy was genuine. And 6 ships had been sitting in the dark outside sensor range since before any of it started. Both things were true at the same time, and Seth sat with both of them and felt the shape of a reclassification happening inside his understanding, not violent, not sudden, more like a very large and slow thing settling into a new position, taking the landscape with it. We were never, he thought, the ones who needed protecting at this table. Osei was standing by the display again. The display was quieter now. The Kreth fleet was gone in any formation sense. The 6 human vessels were holding position. The station's shields were still at 40%, but the reason to care about that had changed. Vorak walked to her. Seth watched from across the room. He could not hear what they said. He could see Vorak's posture and Osei's posture, and the shape of the exchange. Vorak asking something, Osei answering something, Vorak asking again, with slightly different body language. Osei's response brief and level. They talked for 3 minutes. Vorak came back to stand beside Seth. She says they will hold position until we confirm the station is secure, Vorak said. Then they will return to their assigned positions. Unquote. Seth looked at him. Their assigned positions. Vorak met his eyes. Yes. They both looked at the display. The Dreadnought sat in the dark outside the station, patient, enormous, not going anywhere, until it had decided things were settled enough to go somewhere. Did you know? Seth said. Vorak was quiet for a moment. No, he said. Seth nodded. He went back to his notebook. He found the low-priority report, the one about the hands, the one he had written on the second day and filed without escalating because he could not name what he was looking at with enough certainty to put a classification on it. He looked at it. He had written, possible equipment error, or training artifact, monitor, and reassess. He looked at that for a while. Then he found the escalation field. He changed the classification from low priority to critical. He sat with the timestamp of his original entry. Second day. 14 hours into the sessions. He was 47 hours too late to matter. The situation had resolved itself without him, without his report, without anything he had done or failed to do making any practical difference to the outcome. He filed it anyway, because it was the right file to have on record. Because the right record was the honest record. Because somewhere, in some future analysis of this week, his note about a diplomat's hands that did not shake during an emergency drill was going to be a useful data point for someone who needed to understand what they were working with. He put his notebook in his bag. Across the muster point, Danny had found a full cup of coffee his own. Somehow, he had kept track of it through all of this, and was drinking it with the calm expression of a man whose morning had not gone quite as planned, but who was fundamentally untroubled by mornings that did not go as planned. Seth looked at him. He thought about what he now knew and what that knowing felt like sitting inside his chest. He thought about the corridor, and the 4 seconds, and the gunner's meal. He thought about the Dreadnought outside, sitting in the dark, patient, certain, real. He thought about dinner. He thought, quite deliberately and with full awareness of everything he had just understood, that it was important to be friendly. Specifically and deliberately, it was important to be friendly. He crossed the room. "Danny," he said. Danny looked at him. "Would you want to get dinner tonight?" Seth said. "After all of this is settled." Danny looked at him for a moment. Something moved in his face, not surprise. Not quite. More like the recognition of a question that had more than one layer. "Yeah," he said. "Absolutely." He smiled. It was a real smile. Seth was certain of that. He was also certain it was a choice. Both things were true. He was learning to hold both things at once. The station took 3 days to fully settle. Not physically, the structural damage to the commercial wing was significant but clean. The kind of damage that engineers understood and could work with, and the repair teams had a timeline within 6 hours of the attack. The station's bones were fine. What took 3 days was everything else. The communications backlog, the security assessments, the formal incident reports that every department had to file in triplicate because that was what the Concord required after an event of this classification. And the event had a classification now, and the classification required paperwork, and the paperwork required time. The Kreth Dominion sent a communication on the second day. It arrived through an intermediary, which was what you did when you had just had 12 of your ships removed from a tactical formation by something you had not known existed. And you needed to say something official about it, but were not yet sure what the correct tone was. The communication expressed regret for the incident. It described the events as arising from a miscalculation of the regional security situation. It used the word miscalculation 4 times in 6 paragraphs, which Seth thought was either thorough or compulsive, and he was not sure which. The communication did not mention the Dreadnought by name. It did not mention the human vessels at all. It was, Seth thought, the communication of a party that had learned something and was hoping the learning did not have to be discussed too directly. The human vessels held their position for 31 hours after the engagement. Then, one by one, the escorts moved, not leaving, repositioning, settling into a wider pattern around the station like points on a perimeter that happened to also be navigational coordinates. The Dreadnought moved last and moved least, adjusting by a few thousand kilometers to a position that the station's sensor team mapped and then looked at for a long time, without saying anything. The position put the Dreadnought between the station and the direction the Kreth had come from. It was a very simple geometry. Seth noted it in his records under the heading times, positioning, post-engagement times, and then stared at the heading for a while before deciding it was accurate enough to keep. He slept properly on the second night. He had not expected to. He lay down in his bunk in the research quarters and thought he would be awake for hours, the same way he had been awake for hours every night since the sessions began. And instead he was asleep within minutes and did not wake until morning, which was its own kind of information. He thought about what it meant that the presence of an enormous warship positioned between him and the people who had just tried to destroy his station was the thing that let him sleep. He thought about that for a while. He did not write it down. Some things were just true and did not need to be a note. Dinner with Danny on the first night after the attack had been quiet and easy in a way that surprised Seth, though he thought afterward that it probably should not have surprised him. They ate in the station's small crew canteen. The main dining facilities were in the commercial wing, still under repair, and the food was simple, and the light was not great, and there were repair teams in the corridor outside, making the kind of noise that repair teams made. It was not a diplomatic dinner. It was not staged or careful. Danny talked about the ship he had come in on. Not in technical terms, not in classified terms, just the way you talked about a place where you had spent a lot of time. He talked about the bunk assignments and the particular sound, the ventilation system made at 0200, and a cook named Petrov, who made something from potatoes that Danny described as life-changing. He talked about a crewmate who had recently gotten married and how the whole deck had passed around a collection to send a gift, which had taken 6 hours of negotiation to agree on, because 20 people in close quarters for long periods of time developed very strong opinions about gift-giving. He talked about the giraffe. The craftsman who had made it was his uncle. It had taken 3 weeks, and his uncle had complained every day of those 3 weeks about the neck. which was technically very difficult to do in that wood at that grain, and had called Danny twice in the middle of the night to discuss the neck. "Did he fix it?" Seth asked. "He fixed it," Danny said. "He always fixes it. He just needs to complain first." Seth thought about the carving on the side table in the diplomatic hall, the grain of the wood moving with the shape of the animal's body. "Tell him it's beautiful," Seth said. Danny smiled. "I will." They did not talk about the corridor. They did not talk about the 4 seconds. They did not talk about the Dreadnought, or the 9 minutes and 40 seconds, or the gunner's meal, or any of the things that Seth had been turning over in his mind for 2 days. Seth thought about bringing it up 3 times and did not bring it up, partly because he was not sure what he would ask, partly because the food was good, and the conversation was easy, and there was a version of this dinner that was simply 2 people eating in a damaged station after a hard week. And he found, to his own mild surprise, that he wanted that version. He wanted to sit across from someone and eat food and talk about nothing complicated for an hour. Danny seemed to want the same thing. Or he performed wanting the same thing perfectly. Seth decided, eating his second helping of something made from a Verith grain that paired unexpectedly well with a human spice Ray's had produced from somewhere, that both of those were probably true, and that being able to hold both of them at once without it ruining the dinner was, in fact, the correct response to the situation. That is, both things were true. The dinner was good. The emergency session of the Concord opened on the 4th day. All senior delegates attended. Several who had not been on the station appeared via secure transmission, their faces in small panels along the side of the main diplomatic hall, some of them clearly at the far end of an uncomfortable journey through rush authorization channels to get connected in time. The hall was fuller than it had been at any point in the negotiations. Everyone had something to say about what had happened, and most of them were saying it simultaneously in the pre-session period, until Vorak's aide got the quiet signals working, and the room settled into something approaching order. Seth sat in his usual place against the back wall. The human delegation sat on their side of the table. 9 people, same as day 1. Osei in the center. The same calm arrangement, the same posture, the same quiet readiness that Seth had spent 7 days learning to read correctly. He looked at them and thought about who they had been in his understanding on the first day, and who they were in his understanding now. And the distance between those 2 things was not comfortable, and he was not trying to make it. Comfortable. Comfortable was not the goal. Accurate was the goal. The session opened with a formal statement from the Concord's senior mediator, a very old Verith named Thaz, who had been mediating interstellar disputes for longer than some of the current member species had been in space. He spoke slowly, and with the precision of someone who chose every word, the way an engineer chose a load-bearing component, not for elegance, but for function. He said that the events of 3 days ago had clarified certain questions that the Concord had been considering for some time regarding the value of a formal partnership with humanity. He said that the Concord owed the human delegation and the human vessels that had intervened an acknowledgement that was beyond the scope of standard diplomatic language. He said that what happened to this station and what did not happen to this station were both directly connected to the presence of that delegation and those vessels. He said he would now open the floor to the motion for full partnership status. The motion was made before he finished the sentence. The second was immediate. The vote was called. It was unanimous before the full count was completed. Members were signaling affirmative before their turns arrived, which was technically out of order, and those allowed it, without comment, which was itself a comment. Even the 2 members who had consistently abstained from preliminary partnership discussions through 3 years of pre-contact negotiations voted in favor, and one of them said, very quietly, into a microphone she may not have realized was still active, "There is no useful alternative." Seth heard that. He wrote it in his notebook. He looked at it. There is no useful alternative. He put his pen down and looked at the vote results on the main display, and thought about how a room full of some of the most experienced diplomats in the Concord had arrived at a unanimous decision in under 4 minutes, and whether that was wisdom or something that rhymed with wisdom from the outside, but was a different thing on the inside. He thought it was probably both. He was getting used to things being both. Osei spoke after the vote. She thanked the Concord with language that was gracious without being excessive. She spoke about the value of cooperation across species lines, about the shared interest in stable and peaceful transit corridors, about the long work of building trust between peoples who were new to each other, and the importance of patience in that process. She said humanity looked forward to a long and productive partnership. She said this in a voice that was warm and genuine, and perfectly calibrated, and made all the right sounds at all the right volumes, and every word was true. And Seth heard all of it, and believed all of it, and also sat very still, listening to the specific music of a person who knew exactly what they were doing, with every syllable. He waited until the formal session had concluded, and the room had moved into the informal reception period, drinks, small food, the kind of conversation that was personal and off-record, and actually, how a lot of the real diplomatic work got done. Then he crossed the room. She saw him coming. He was sure of that. She tracked him from about 4 meters out, and adjusted her position slightly, so that they were at a slight remove from the nearest group, just enough to hold a conversation that would not be overheard. She did this without making it obvious she was doing it. He stood in front of her. She waited. "I want to ask you something," he said, directly, without diplomatic framing. "All right," she said. "How long were your ships out there?" he said. "Before we invited you in." She looked at him, not the careful blankness, not the perfectly calibrated warmth. She just looked at him, and it was a real look, and he felt the weight of it. She was deciding something. He waited. The half-second came and went, that same brief thing he had seen in the muster point, something arriving from the inside, rather than being placed there. Then it settled, and her face found its usual register, not quite the diplomatic warmth, but something closer to the way people looked when they were being honest. And being honest was not simple. "We came in peace, xenobiologist Seth," she said. "We always come in peace first." He looked at her. She looked back. She did not answer the question. She would not answer the question. He understood, standing in front of her, that she was not avoiding it. She had answered it in the grammar of what she said, in the specific weight of the word first, in the pause before it, and the steadiness after it. She had answered it completely. He just had to be willing to hear it. "Thank you," he said. She nodded. She moved back toward Vorak, who was waiting to speak to her about something. Seth watched her go. He went back to his office that evening. He did not open the archive. He did not do any reading. He sat at his desk and opened his notebook to a fresh page, and held his pen, and looked at the blank space. He had a report to write, not the escalated one that was filed, the final one, the xenobiological behavioral assessment that was the formal product of his assignment. Observations, analysis, conclusions, recommendations. The document that would go into the Concord's research record and be cited by other researchers and read by policy staff who needed to understand what humanity was. He sat with the blank page. He thought about how to describe them. He thought about the gifts first. The carved giraffe, and the music box, and the careful wrapping, and the ribbon. He thought about how the warmth was real. He was going to say that clearly and without hedging, because it was true and required in a document about truth. The warmth was real. The curiosity was real. Danny's jokes were real, and Reyes's interest in Verith biochemistry was real, and Osei's patient diplomacy was real. These were not manufactured. He would stake his professional reputation on that, and had, implicitly, by eating their food and laughing at their jokes and sitting across from them for 8 days. He thought about the pilot and the exits and the drill response in the hands. He thought about the cultural archive and the old songs, and the museums full of old weapons visited on days off. He thought about the deterrence file. The capability must be real. He thought about the Dreadnought. He thought about the gunner eating his meal. He picked up his pen. He wrote for 2 hours. He wrote carefully and specifically, and with the particular discipline of a researcher who understood that the document he was writing would be read by people who had not been in this room, and had not watched these hands, and had not eaten that food and needed the words to do the work that experience could not do for them. He wrote about behavioral indicators and threat response patterns and cultural archive analysis. He wrote about cooperative signaling and its consistency across all observed interactions. He wrote about the gap between surface presentation and demonstrated capability. And he was careful with his language in that section, careful not to make it sound like deception. When it was not deception, it was simply the difference between what a person showed you and what a person was. And all species had that gap, and the question was always only one of degree. He wrote about the degree. He wrote about 9 minutes and 40 seconds. He looked at what he had written. He went to the top of the document where the classification field was. He had typed the word times, civilization times, in the subject classification field when he set up the document on the first day, because that was the standard term for what you were assessing in a first contact xenobiological report. Civilization. It was the correct term. It was defined in the Concord's research protocol and used consistently across 42 prior first contact assessments. He looked at it. He highlighted it. He deleted it. He typed 2 words. He looked at those 2 words for a long time. Then he saved the document. He closed his notebook. Outside the station, in the dark between the 2 star systems, the human vessels held their positions. The Dreadnought sat between the station and the direction the Kreth had come from, patient and enormous, and entirely still. The way, very certain things were still. Its running lights were on, not its full array, not the active sensor broadcast, just the ordinary lights that any vessel showed in the dark to say it was there. A courtesy, a simple signal. I am here. In the diplomatic hall, the carved giraffe sat on the side table under a small display light. The wood caught the light along the grain the way the craftsman had intended, the animal's long neck rising out of the material, as if it had always been in there, and needed only to be found. The music box sat beside it, closed. The spice container had been opened by one of the Verith kitchen staff who had asked about it and been encouraged to try it. And the dish they had made with it had been served at the post-vote reception and eaten entirely, every portion of it, which was the kind of small thing that happened during a historic week and got overlooked, and was, in its own way, exactly as important as any of the rest of it. Seth locked his office and walked to the canteen. Danny was already there. He had a cup of coffee and a second cup waiting on the other side of the table, and he was reading something on a small personal screen that he put away when Seth sat down. "How did the report go?" Danny said. Seth looked at him. "Long," he said. Danny nodded. "Hungry?" "Yes." They ordered. The food came. It was simple and warm and good. They talked about nothing difficult. About the giraffe and the uncle who complained about the neck. About a Verith dish that Danny had been thinking about since the first time he tried it and wanted to know if the kitchen could make again. About the music box, which Seth had finally opened that afternoon, and which played 7 bars of something old and simple that he could not identify, and had decided to look up later. Seth did not bring up the report. He did not bring up the Dreadnought or the classification field or the 2 words he had typed. He ate his food and drank the coffee, which was better than the station's standard reconstituted version, because Danny had produced it from somewhere on the human ship that he was vague about, and it was genuinely very good coffee. And Seth drank it and thought that this was the correct response, not because he had decided the other things did not matter. They mattered. He had spent 8 days determining exactly how much they mattered, and the answer was completely. Completely and permanently, and in ways that the Concorde was going to be processing for a long time. But the correct response to that was not to treat the coffee differently. The coffee was good. The dinner was good. Danny was here, and the giraffe was on the table in the diplomatic hall, and the warmth was real. All of those things were true. The 2 words in the classification field were also true. He was learning to hold all of it at once. It got slightly easier every hour. He thought, for reasons that were completely clear to him now, that it was important to keep practicing. The report was published 3 weeks later in the Concord's Xenobiological Research Database, under standard access, available to any registered researcher. Most people who read it noted the behavioral analysis section and the cultural archive cross-references. A few noted the deterrence theory discussion. One senior policy researcher wrote a response paper that cited the drill response observations as the most practically useful section of the document. Almost no one noticed the classification field. The 2 words sat at the top of the document in the same small font as all the other administrative fields: date, author, assignment number, status, subject classification, and most readers moved past them, the way readers moved past administrative fields, which was quickly and without particular attention. One researcher noticed. She was a young Verith academic studying first contact protocols, writing a thesis on the gap between pre-contact expectation and post-contact assessment. She was reading the report for its methodology when she reached the top of the document and read back through the fields to check the classification. She stopped. She read the 2 words. She read the whole report again, from the beginning. Then she read it a third time. Then she sat at her desk for a long time looking at the 2 words at the top of the document. Then she sent Seth a message, asking if he was available to speak about his methodology. He responded within an hour. He said yes. He said he was happy to discuss it. He said bring questions. Subject classification: Apex Predator.